Which actually, what I should do, let's go to results, just to prove, definitively.
A few moments later.
As a song associated with Air Raid, pretty much. Oh, I'm gonna fucking die here. I'm gonna fucking die here. Uh-oh. 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 Yep, that's how it goes. I shouldn't have been talking, I should have been playing the video game. Devil May Cry was released in 2001, published by Capcom, and developed by an in-house studio calling itself Team Little Devils. The game was highly successful both critically and commercially, and is lauded for changing how game designers viewed 3D action games. It basically invented a genre commonly referred to as character action, depending on who you ask. But despite this high-profile reputation, the first Devil May Cry seems to be getting some flack in retrospect for being outdated. Hell, even the game's director, Hideki Kamiya, commented on a desire to see the original game remade, if these tweets are genuine and not a joke, like the new God of War. Jeez, I guess Scalebound getting cancelled really did make the guy lose it. All kidding aside, and speaking as a total nobody in response to a successful game designer and director, I have to disagree with Kamiya on this. During my livestream of the game, I actually spoke a little of my thoughts on the idea of a DMC remake. A DMC 1 remake, I think, is a disaster waiting to happen. That's just my opinion, though. But in my opinion, this game is not only perfectly fine as is, I would actually argue that DMC 1 does things today better than does a lot of things today better than most games. Instead of letting my barely literate livestream self be the only expression of my feelings on the matter, I decided to take a look back at Devil May Cry from the perspective of someone who absolutely loves the game to death, and thinks that a lot of action games today can learn a thing or two from it, for better and for worse. There are 7 aspects of the game's design which, in my opinion, can work as examples for aspiring game designers to work from when making their own kick-ass action games. But I do have to stress before starting that these are just an outsider's opinions. I'm not anywhere near talented enough to design video games, and all of these lessons extrapolated from DMC are just the opinions of an avid fanboy and gamer. Also, just want to give a quick shout out to Codex entry and his video, What We Can Learn from Devil May Cry 3, which is essentially him doing the exact same thing, but for the third game rather than the first. I recommend watching it, since it predates this video by a fair bit, and is actually a pretty damn good look at the game in its own right. So, with that nonsense out of the way,
let's rock, baby.
Devil May Cry has rock-solid core gameplay mechanics based pretty much entirely around its combat. Dante can either attack with melee weapons or shoot. There are more guns than melee weapons for the player to choose from, with the Owl's Sword and Ifrit Gauntlets being the 2 primary options compared to the 4 or 5 unique firearms at the player's disposal. Melee attacks are significantly stronger than guns, though are obviously a much riskier choice due to their more limited range. You can have one gun and one melee weapon equipped at a time, and pairing those together can complement one another. One of the first tricks that the player is likely to come across is using the sword's high time uppercut to launch an enemy into the air, and then using rapid shots from the ebony and ivory handguns to keep them afloat. The simplicity of how it controls is another thing, as attacking is done with only 2 buttons: triangle for melee and square for guns. It's easy to pick up and grasp, though the real linchpin of DMC's combat that gave it the variety it truly needed was the pause combo. Essentially, the player can pull off different moves and combos by timing when they press the triangle button. Hammering it without pause will put it at a basic 1-2-3 combo. Doing 2 hits and waiting a fraction of a second between the second and the third button presses will start a 4 to 5 hit attack, and taking a single swing, pausing, and then hammering triangle will start up the gratifying million stab. These are paired with joystick direction based moves, such as holding the stick backward from Dante's current position to perform high time. Ignoring how differently the Ifrit Gauntlets work, and completely glossing over the other mechanics like Devil Trigger, the additional moves that you can purchase from the in-game store, and how the different enemies and bosses shake up encounters, Devil May Cry's fundamentals are incredibly strong. You could take away the game's aesthetic design and boil encounters down to polygonal levels and wireframe models, and the core game would still be fun. Granted, DMC has stellar art direction and sound design, and is a significantly better package with those included. The point is that it's always the best bet to make sound core mechanics and fundamental elements of your game first, and afterward going crazy with the supporting details like story, visuals, and audio to reinforce that core experience. One of the labels commonly thrown on the first DMC is that it's a button masher, and this irritates me to no end simply because of how inaccurate it is. To me, calling something a button masher implies that there's a mindless quality to the combat, with the player simply pressing a button or two over and over without any thought and succeeding regardless. I'm convinced that the only people who actually make this argument are those who have only ever beat the game on easy automatic and never even touched the game on Dante Must Die, the hardest difficulty. DMC reinforces this through its enemies, which all require different strategies of beating instead of just hammering triangle like some would have you to believe. Sure, you can mash the puppet enemies well enough, but the fetishes, blades, and sin scissors all block your attacks. Shadows aren't vulnerable to melee at all until their core has been exposed. Frosts are resistant to slash damage and can still tank through Ifrit's punches. The plasmas mimic Dante and can dodge roll out of attack chains, and the nobodies just hop away from your combos. Simply put, you can't just mash attack and hope to win, since the vast majority of enemies have at least one aspect which makes this a pain to try and pull off. It isn't as if it comes out of nowhere either, as the game's first boss fight quickly establishes hammering buttons will get you nowhere fast. Phantom, a giant lava spider, is almost entirely invulnerable. Attacks against his hide will do no damage. He has two weak spots where he can't be hurt from though. One is a spot on his back, and the other is his face. It isn't as cut and dry as just hammering away at one of those two spots either, as Phantom will both block player attacks and attack himself if you attack from the front, and has a pretty nasty counter if you try to attack his back. Careful positioning, timing, and on Dante Must Die, proper use of double trigger is required to put this guy down. Phantom was just the start of a trend that Devil May Cry excelled at. All bosses prior to the final encounter with Mundus are teaching the player to master different aspects of the combat system. Nello Angelo's combos and extremely high damage output force players to learn a reactive playstyle, and that being the aggressor isn't always the best path. Griffin teaches players how to effectively manage Devil Trigger to use their guns in a viable offensive manner. Lastly, Nightmare is a hard lesson in patience while waiting for attack openings and how to counter boss moves effectively. All four serve a direct purpose, to better teach the player tricks and elements of the combat through a sort of trial by fire, rather than just giving them an info dump in the menu screen. This is an aspect of Devil May Cry's design that would be expanded upon and improved in the 2, and only 2, sequels that the game has at the time of this writing. But even right off the bat in the first game, no other action game does the in-the-moment ranking quite as well as the kind we see here with the style system. Honestly, I think this concept for an action game is nothing short of genius. The player is graded on their combat performance in the heat of the moment from the lowly D rank all the way up to S. Words and bright neon-colored text accompany the rank, from dull, cool, bravo, absolute, and the coveted stylish. The game giving you consistent feedback on performance in a unique yet clear way is well enough on its own, but how style is raised is what sells it. With a few troublesome exceptions, you can't just raise style indefinitely by not getting hit by enemies, but attacking with the same move over and over. No, style is raised by mixing and matching your moves to spice up encounters. After you use a single move, an invisible countdown timer starts, and if you use the same move before this countdown runs out, you'll receive little to no bump in your style. This system is brilliant if we're being blunt about it. It's another method of reinforcing to the player that mashing the attack button and spamming a single move is something to be frowned upon, usually resulting in the game calling you dull constantly. On top of that, the invisible timer constantly is pushing the player to get in the action as fast as possible, trying out as many moves as they can to maximize their style. Comparing this to something like the point system seen in Vanquish, style is an unmatched system. It's clear from a cursory glance how you're doing in the moment, and becomes clear very early on in a playthrough as to how it's raised and how it's lowered. Sadly, not everything that developers should take away from DMC is positive, as while the combat-centric core of the game is an ass-tight experience from beginning to end, the two other significant gameplay additions are half-baked at best. Of course, I'm talking about the platforming and swimming in the game. Jumping around in Devil May Cry is an awkward task made troublesome by Dante's bizarre jump arc and the Resident Evil style fixed camera angles. With the camera zoomed out away from the platform you need to jump on, and depicting it from an odd angle so often, precise platforming can be one hell of a nuisance. At least there are some cheap ways to get around the worst examples. Swimming, on the other hand, adds pretty much nothing to the core game. You only use it in 3 missions for under a minute each time, and the combat sections with the underwater-only needle gun are slow and clunky affairs. Mission 18 on Dante Must Die has the potential to be the single most irritating part of that playthrough, because of the slight randomization of an enemy you fight underwater. If this Sin Scissor here decides to go further to the player's left rather than to the right into their line of sight, then it can easily get a quick pot shot off on you and take out an absurdly large chunk of health. Both of the swimming and platforming segments are very brief asides in the total package, but I don't think anyone would argue that the game would be better off without these two parts. The takeaway here, to learn from DMC's mistakes, is to add variety to the gameplay if what you're adding reinforces the core foundation that you set up, not distract or actively detract from it. An example of good variety found in the game, which some may disagree with me on, is the first phase of the Mundus boss fight. The core of DMC still remains. You learn the boss's attack patterns, shoot with square, melee with triangle, and pull DT for some big damage, though the style is totally different. Rather than the slash 'em up style that the game has trained the player on for hours up to that point, the gameplay shifts to something of a Space Harrier or Star Fox light. Despite this, the focus still remains on fighting an enemy above all else, so it gets a pass in my book. Reusing existing assets to create new in-game challenges is a great, tried and true way to save resources and overall development time. Depending who you ask, it's either a saving grace or a necessary evil, but since I'd argue that asset reuse is inevitable at some point, how one goes about doing it is a real make or break. Devil May Cry very heavily reuses levels from the first half and the second half, and in one of the most contentious design aspects of the game, each boss is fought 3 times as well. Well, 4 times in Phantom's case, but I digress. The level reuse is an easy thing to defend, since the reused maps are remixed slightly to alleviate tedium and are given a hellish makeover in some cases for visual variety. The boss fights, while a divisive choice, in my opinion works wholeheartedly. For one thing, each reuse of a boss is fought in a brand new arena, usually with their own quirks to overcome. On top of that, they almost always have new moves to shake things up a bit, and keep the player from growing complacent. In short, enough is different between the bosses in each fight that it works. Let's compare that to how Devil May Cry 4 reuses its assets, whereas Dante you had to play through the whole game entirely again in reverse, and the majority of the bosses were fought 3 times in the exact same arenas with the exact same attacks in each encounter. As much as I love the combat system in DMC 4, I can't defend that kind of asset reuse, especially when DMC 1 should be heralded as the best example of how to make reuse effective. In short, when reusing assets, which you'll absolutely have to do at some point, be clever and put some thought into how you do it. Too many games just have their difficulty modes boil down to enemies having more or less health and doing more or less damage. It's a predictable decision, and too often games think that instant kills from damaged sponges equates to an interesting challenge. Devil May Cry, on the other hand, does things a bit differently, as few other games so carefully balance and change each difficulty mode. Normal is exactly as it says, and is probably what most people watching are familiar with, but the other 3 options have some very interesting changes. Easy Automatic mode gives the player more Devil Trigger to start with, weaker enemies that take and give less damage, and some enemies are just missing. The fetishes, frosts, and shadows are entirely absent from Easy Auto, most likely because those 3 in particular require more skill and thought from the player. Hard has enemies and bosses give and take more damage, but what's more interesting is how the enemy placements are remixed. You fight shadows as soon as the second mission, and tougher enemies like frosts and the Death Scythe mini-boss are introduced earlier and in greater numbers as well. The game's hardest difficulty, Dante Must Die, is where things get really interesting. Bosses get a buff, with about 2.5 times the health and doing significantly more damage to boot, but the enemies get a more interesting change. While doing more damage, they actually have less base health than they do on normal. The catch is that each enemy can now pop Devil Trigger of their own, as the game will either have a hard countdown or an invisible one based on how long a single enemy has been on screen. Once that clock runs out, the enemy or group all become significantly stronger, doing far more damage, getting new attacks, and getting heavy resistance to stun. It adds even more pressure on the player, and basically requires them to get aggressive in combat to avoid having all their foes get even stronger. The point is, each difficulty mode is actually very different from all of the rest, and how major or subtle the changes can be demonstrates just how much thought was put into the difficulty here. The takeaway, if nothing else, is to think about how you're making the game harder or easier. There isn't anything inherently wrong with just adjusting the damage input and output, But when comparing most difficulty modes in games to what Team Little Devils did with DMC, they just fall short. One of the most important questions one should ask themselves when making their game, and something I don't think many actually do, is why is this included? This can refer to mechanics, enemies, weapons, pretty much anything. The ideal should be, with this kind of reflection, to only include things that you have a valid reason for. Something that strengthens the core experience instead of simply being included for its own sake. Barring the most glaring example with the swimming, Devil May Cry is actually pretty damn good for this. Each feature, move, and mechanic has some valid reason to be included in the game. While criticized in hindsight by some people for having a limited moveset, DMC exceeds at making each addition to the move list matter in its own way. No matter what it is, each move is great in at least one situation. Just giving a few examples, something passive like Rolling Blaze is perfect for countering Nightmare's attacks and Nelangelo's summoned swords. Vortex mows through regular enemies and is great for fighting back against Phantom in the sections when you're intended to run away. And Round Trip is great for dealing consistent damage to flying enemies like Death's Sides and Mundus' second phase. These are just a few examples, and you can say the same for pretty much anything at the player's disposal in this game. The later games, DMC 3 and 4, took a different direction by giving the player a boatload of different abilities, with many being viable solutions to in-game challenges. This is a perfectly good direction to take an action game in. Those games are also among the best of their kind on the market, but there's just something about the tight nature of DMC 1 where everything had a purpose. This kind of thoughtful design extends to how Devil Trigger works here. The passive healing bump it gives you reduces as you raise the difficulty, meaning that as you're getting better, you can't rely on it as a crutch. DT provides unique moves and combos, and since these are extremely powerful, they're tied exclusively to the DT gauge. DT being limited to the gauge is a well done concept, as there is both a penalty for misuse and many different ways to replenish it. DT works on how many runes you have under your health bar, and if you turn it on and then quickly off again, you're punished for your lack of forethought by losing a full DT rune on top of what you already burned for starting it to begin with. This is done to not allow for easy abuse of DT, and considering that DT attacks are the only reliable way to get significant damage on bosses in Dante Must Die, proper knowledge of how and when to use DT becomes a massive priority. Since DT management is so vital, there are a variety of ways to get it back. Shooting your guns is the safest, and even shooting Phantom on his invincible hide repeatedly will bring some of it back. You can also get a full rune back or more through a much higher risk, higher reward method. Go right up to an enemy's face and taunt them. This is great on two levels, as it's a ballsy way to get back your DT, and it's a fun bit of gameplay that ties in with Dante's Devil May Cry personality. Even beyond those two, you can see this kind of thought put into even the smallest bits of Devil May Cry's design. You're penalized for using items to disincentivize you from using them as a crutch. The charge attack by the Ifrit gauntlets and the pistols are just long enough to keep the style meter going. I could go on, but the point is clear. Nearly every aspect of DMC's design was carefully thought out and implemented, from something as minor as how you can regain DT to things as major as the pause combos. The attention to detail placed into the game's mechanics and features is nearly unparalleled in games that we see coming out today, and it's probably the number one thing that keeps Devil May Cry still a top-of-the-line action game. It's something I personally wish developers today would take note of, to only include things in their games that make a notable improvement to the core fundamentals. In case you can't tell from the sheer amount of blind praise I've heaped on it, I love Devil May Cry. It's an all-time favorite, and I still place it head and shoulders above most other third-person action games released today. Even 17 years after its release, Devil May Cry is something that should be held up as a genre standard, and is worth taking a few notes from to learn a thing or two.